Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for your message. This is one that's trying to connect what you talked about this morning to the reality of this community. Over the past summer, unfortunately, we've lost 3 high school graduates in this community. 2 to suicide and 1 didn't make it. How do you connect that pain? Because I'm pretty sure everybody in this congregation either knows somebody or was directly affected by that. How do you bring that hope, that news in real terms? How do you come alongside people? A lot of people are really scared in those times. How do you do that?
Yeah. That's a great question, and thank you for opening up something that sensitive to the community. 3 years ago, I lost a family member to suicide. So that's really, really close to my heart as well. What I'd like to say is that ultimately, this whole word, even apologetics, that we throw around with our ministry, where it's located is in 1 Peter 3:15. It says, "In your heart set apart Christ as Lord. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that you have, and do it with gentleness and respect." A lot of times when we hear, I want to share my faith or I have to defend my faith, we think of it in terms of argumentative or defense or even just logical reasons, right? The whole purpose of what I do and what I think anyone who would call themselves a Christian, anyone who's been included in the family of God, the Great Commission, if you've heard of that before, we're told to go into all the world and preach the gospel, is that really why we need to preach it and why we're called to preach it is it's not just a way of thinking. It's so much more than rules and morality and joining a holy club. It's a reason for hope. And actually, exactly because of the message that I've preached today is why we need to speak this message so clearly, that Jesus is the only one who is able to go. It doesn't matter what background you're from. It doesn't matter the judgment that you've placed on yourself or society places on you or the culture you come from or what your economic status. It doesn't matter what seemingly hopeless situation or group or situation life you come from. I love you. I have a plan for you. I am the God who speaks identity. I'm the one who created you in love. I give you an identity because you're loved whether or not you ever do the right things or have earned it. And because of that, I give you a purpose and a way to hold on to hope and a way to bring other people in. We need to share that this message is a reason for hope. It's a reason that you have an identity that's unshakable, whether or not you've been bullied, whether or not you love your body or not, whether or not you're dealing through long-term depression, that Jesus and his message is not based just on feelings. It's not based just on arguments. It's not based just on behavior. It's based on who he was, how he lived, and the offer he gives to us, and then his real living presence today that we're invited into. Why the resurrection is so important and pushing into that is looking into the evidence for the fact that Jesus actually did come back from the grave. It gives us the confidence that it's not just a story that happened 2,000 years ago. The Bible says the same power, the same spirit of resurrection, if it's that word, and sometimes we talk about the spirit, it can seem a little crazy. The same force, power, person of Jesus Christ that was raised from the dead is alive and at work in us when we enter into relationship. So it's big enough to conquer the thoughts of death that we have in our heart. It's big enough to conquer the culture of death that we have. What happens when we still struggle with it? It gives us hope and an ability to walk through it. So that's just a brief answer to that. But the problem of pain and suffering is a big and hard question. And so keep asking your questions. Anyone else follow up on that or a different question?
One question that I thought, you've said that Christianity is really inclusive. Anyone who wants to know God, he invites everybody. And that way Christianity is this really inclusive message. But we're here with lots of books and people, and Christianity is prominent. But there are lots of people around the world who don't have any access to hear this invitation that Jesus makes to everybody. Aren't those people excluded from this good news and left out?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And that actually can get to the heart and root of why a lot of people wrestle with this idea of exclusion still. They go, well, it's only inclusive for those who have heard. How do we know that everyone is going to get a chance to hear? Two things, food for thought, I would say. Most of the time, actually all of the time, that question only comes from people who have had a chance to hear, right? What do I mean by that? It's interesting that people that have heard, that have been given the opportunity, come and consider who Jesus is. That often we go, I don't really want to consider for myself, so what about that person? And don't we do that with a lot of things in life? When it gets a little too close to home, when we're actually feeling like, ooh, this could change the way I have to live, this could change, the way I live my life, we want to take a step back and go, well, what about that person? Can you speak to that for that person? We need to take this message of Jesus Christ for ourselves and go, is Jesus who he says he is? Is he all loving? Is he all just? Is he really good? And if he is those things, and I truly believe that, and I've committed myself to believing that, then it's not too big of a step for me to trust and believe him that he will and has done and will continue to do everything completely possible to give that same opportunity that I've had to be invited into that to every person across the earth. Now, more than that being just a theory, right? Let's just look at where the largest populations of those beginning to believe in Jesus are happening across the world. It's in all the places of the world that aren't from the normal Western Christian upbringing. Christianity is exploding in China, even though for decades it's been not allowed to be preached there. Christianity exploded in communist countries that did away with God and let God be dead. Christianity, the number one place that it's growing is within Muslim countries. You know why and you know how? I mean, if you haven't taken a chance to read, a colleague of mine, Nabil Qureshi, he's written Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. I love that title, why it's such a great book. It is one personal, credible response of his own story of doing this. There are people around the world, and I'm just picking one religion because that one religion is the one that tends to be, we don't want to believe in Jesus as the Son of God at all. One that some people would say is most hostile towards Christianity. In the midst of Nabil's search for Allah, not wanting to find Jesus, crusading against Jesus, setting out his life to say this is not true, seeking Allah, Jesus collides with him. There is story after story after story of people in Muslim nations that have had no introduction, that are not being preached to, that are not being evangelized to, that in their desperate cry and search for truth, crying out to their God, Allah, Jesus Christ shows up. And it's not some strange, well, I'm not sure who I'm following anymore. Jesus comes and says, follow me. Like Saul of Damascus opportunities. I worked in Oxford with a guy who had to change his name. He was the top imam in a Muslim country that I shouldn't mention. And he was actually like the apostle, well, like Saul before he turned the Apostle Paul. He had pictures and footage of where he would go out zealous and he was killing Christians. He would seek them out, find underground Christians in the area he was from, and stone them to death. Still happening within the last decade. He was in the middle of Ramadan. He was devout. He was a top leader. Fasting. Jesus Christ appeared to him and said, I'm real. What are you doing? He found one of the underground churches because he knew where all of them were. And he was so well known that the Christians didn't want to talk to him. They thought that they were going to die. And it was, similar experience to the Apostle Paul coming on Ananias. And when he actually went, no, I'm not here to kill you, he came to salvation and then had to be smuggled out and lives in England today. Lives in England today, spreading the message of the fact that Jesus Christ is true. I have story after story after story. It's a question more on our hearts, those of us who have heard, do we really trust that God really is love? And he cares every single person, for God so loved the world. And if that is the case, his heart, like Peter says, is that none should perish. And that he has always been doing, and what the story of humanity is a finite set of time when every person that he's ever created, that ever walked the earth, will have many multiple opportunities to come to Jesus. It might not look the way it looks for you and me with the sermon being preached, but that doesn't mean that we should judge whether people have had a chance or not.
Test. Thanks. I want to ask about God's love and how we communicate that to the world.
Yeah.
In particular, in the context of social media.
Yeah.
Because we see people who call themselves Christians communicating globally through this tool in a way that comes across in a very exclusive messaging. And so if you could speak to how we as Christians ought to think about the way that we, you know, when we tend to try to take a stance and say, this is what I believe. And
That's really great. I think that one of the safest things to do is to focus on Jesus. That doesn't mean that we throw out the rest of the Bible, but I think that Jesus Christ came to fulfill the law and the prophets, he said, right? Jesus Christ did not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. But we do not fully understand. We do not fully get a chance to wrestle with things completely and be able to get God's heart and sense until we look through the lens of love that Jesus brought, until we look through the lens where, just like if someone writes a book, right, an author, God being the author of life, and someone starts wrestling with the story and the meaning of it, you could get a grasp on different things. You can begin to explain to other people what you feel like that book says. You can begin to explain what that message is. Sometimes we do it well, and sometimes people could get the whole point wrong. It takes the author of the story to sit down with a person and to go, let me explain what I really meant. Let me show you what I was thinking in this. Let me show you who I am. And in showing you who I am and the way I think and the way I live, it helps you better interpret, understand, apply, and pass on the message. How amazing that Christianity is the one faith where that's the message of the story. God writes the story of life. God sets it, puts us in it as characters, gives us the space to wrestle with it, calls us to invite other people into it, but doesn't leave us as blind to do that. He came in history to go, let me just clear up and show you exactly on your terms, on who you are, what I meant, what my character is, how much I'll sacrifice to prove my love is boundless through the cross, and then to give you confidence to be able to share it. So I would say Christian media, social media, let's completely focus on Jesus, on his message, on the good news. What is the gospel? The gospel is there is a God, right? And that God is love. Yes, yes, you have to say yes to his love. Yes, there are a whole host of different things, but at the end of the day, for God so loved the world. People have to make up their minds about that and believe that first, right? And wrestle with that first before we put every other thing on top of them. What from within the Christian family we would go, well, that love should make you look like that. Well, this love should make you feel like this. Well, this love means this, this, and this. First, we have to believe love to be able to be changed by love and to be able to spread love. So I think we need to focus on Jesus and his message and offer of inclusion and love and the great sacrifice that it took to make things right when we have broken relationship in our actions and our selfishness. Does that help a little?
Yes, don't go down the goat trail of condemnation.
Yeah, I think that love is a really good way to start and end.
Hi, I've been asked to help type at a Wycliffe translation, and they're using the word Allah in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament I've heard there's even more changes.
Which I'm sorry, I haven't heard of that translation before.
Wycliffe translators,
Wycliffe. Okay.
And it's an Indonesian people that are sending the stuff up to Canada to be typed.
Okay.
And I was just wondering, like, there's a real division. I went into the website, and there's a real division amongst Christians. Should they use the word Allah, or should they stick with the Jewish Old Testament? And so I was wondering how about that.
Well, I'm not familiar with that specific translation, so I want to go and read up on it specifically. But I work with a colleague. She's part of our Asian team. She was Indonesia's first supermodel and found Christ, and now she does apologetics. Look her up, Tracy Trinita. She's got a great story. And she has the great pleasure and privilege of sharing Jesus in that culture. It's actually the largest Muslim nation. it's not a Muslim nation, it's still a secular nation, but the largest amount of Muslim people are within Indonesia grouping. And it is a very unique culture where you are basically banned from saying certain things and speaking different ways, and churches could be shut down, and they have to operate within kind of speaking the truth of the gospel, not being afraid to suffer. Many people have. Many of the people that she has worked with and the pastors she's worked with have suffered for the gospel, so they're not afraid of that, but also being able to phrase things in the right way. I would say, though, in general, Allah, right? And read Nabil on it. Read Dr. Andy Bannister, who's the lead apologist for the Canadian RZIM team, has done 20 years of study in Islam. Allah is fundamentally different in his nature, in his character, than the God that we find in the Bible. The God of Christianity, Yahweh even, I think you can see this even in the New Testament, is a Trinitarian God. He's a God that's never been alone, a God that's perfectly essential in and of himself. He doesn't need anyone or anything outside of himself to be whole, because he's always lived in loving community. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. One thing that brought Nabil to faith and got him to start wrestling with it is that he could say many different kind of parts of the Quran from before he could speak most other things. And the number one phrase that Islamic Muslim children are taught to say is, God is not a father, he has no children. God is not a father, he has no children. What I spoke about today, the inclusion of the Christian message, is that we are all brought in, we're all valid, we're all included. This message of love is true because we're allowed to be different, but the differences are not done away with, but they're focused on is that we're all God's children. He loves us. He cares for us the way a father does. Unending, eternal, preferential love. Allah is lonely. He's been on his by himself all of eternity, right? And so when a God that is alone creates humanity, you have to ask, why were they created? Created because he was lonely, because he had a need. Created because he needs subjects, because he wants to boss people around and cause them to submit. Islam means submission. Created because he wants to judge them. You have to ask, why were you created? And so I think that, I don't want to get down to Wycliffe particularly, because I haven't done that study in that one, but I would say that we need to be careful when we're using similar language. Now, I do think we need to translate things for people. I think it's safer bet when we're talking to Muslims to say Jesus is mentioned in the Quran, rather than saying Allah is the same. Saying, did you know Jesus is mentioned, and talk about who we believe Jesus is, why we believe Jesus actually is the Son of God and is God himself, and what that means. I think we're probably running out of time, but you can come talk to me specifically afterwards. So we need to balance translating what we're talking about, whether it's biblical translations or just in our words, of bringing people in. Like, for instance, in China, translation is not I'm the bread of life, it's I'm the rice of life. It makes more sense, right? That's nothing wrong with that there. It puts it into applicable terms. So we need to just balance translation with changing the message.
I think we have time maybe just for one more quick one. If there's something burning on the front of your mind, this is your last opportunity.
Is it on? I drove out of my neighborhood this morning, and I looked around, and I felt very much alone driving to church. And so in our culture, in our town, really I think, and if you look at young people, Christianity is viewed as exclusive. And when a young person begins to struggle, the first thing they do is pull away.
Yeah.
What are you seeing around the world? How can we as a body communicate something that, you know, if we believe that we have this incredible, life-giving, eternal truth, and other people just turn, you know, go on with their life and everything. I mean, we wrestle with this, but what do you see around the world where that barrier is coming down, where we as a body grab hold of ways and ways of communicating that communicates to people.
Yeah.
Come and search and find him.
Yeah, I think it's two-sided, and it goes down to the heart of the great commandment that Jesus talks about and what we're all called to do. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When we truly get that as Christians, when we get what we're called into is not moralism, what we're called into is not judgment, what we're called into is not a strict God as a speed camera and he's waiting to catch you out, and I have to spend so much time and energy focusing on whether God loves me today or whether I've achieved enough things that I don't have time to worry about everybody else, because I'm worried all of the time about being included myself with the love of God. When we switch that and realize that's not the heart of Christianity. The heart of Christianity is you're loved. While you were still sinners, Christ died for you. Come and walk with me, and come and let that ministry of grace, that ministry of truth, bring the justification you need, bring the righteousness without you having to wrestle with that, without you having to fight for that or try to earn that. When we're freed up in our hearts and minds and emotions to believe God's love is that true and to accept it, it means that we're a lot more concerned with those around us. When you have that identity that's secure in Jesus Christ, a lot of what we faff with, what we worry about, what we're anxious about with acceptance goes away, and we can go, wow, I have an amazing love. I have an amazing truth. I have an amazing worldview that is valid in suffering, that's logical and reasonable with origins of the universe, that calls other people in, that's actually inclusive. And I'm not worried. I'm not afraid about all of that truth. And so because of that, I can bring other people in. I have joy that I can share because I'm not so worried about how do I protect my joy. I have love and an invitation that I can share in confidence because I'm not so worried about am I confident in who God says. So when we really get that about the message and the heart of the gospel, that God is love, he's there and he's for us, and that's not based on our feelings or our behavior or our apologetic arguments, but based on the person of Jesus Christ and what he's done and the work on the cross, then it frees us up to go and now love others the way that God loves you. If he accepts me, then why do I not accept myself? If he forgives me, then why can't I forgive the person that has done the unforgivable? If he goes beyond himself to reach out, to break into human history, to include me when I was kicking and screaming and rejecting him and saying no to him, then maybe I should do that to the Muslim that seems scary to talk to, or to the person who's struggling with their sexuality, or to my teenager who says, thank you very much, but I don't want anything to do with God anymore. Do I react in fear, or do I go, actually, that's what I did to God. That's what humanity has done to God. And look what he has done and what he continues to do, to continue to say, I love you, I'm here for you, and pulling them in. So I think part of it is when we get that right about our understanding of God, it helps to overflow into just letting every single action be weighing up and going, have I learned to love? Am I fulfilling my destiny of sharing God's love? I love God with my heart, soul, and mind. He loves me. And the other thing is I'm called to love other people the way God loves me. And I think that helps focus us on the goal of the gospel. Thank you.
What is a good response to the statement out there today? Your truth is not my truth.
Your truth is not my truth. Yeah. I think that is really common. It's true for you, but it's not true for me, and we can all be happy. I think sometimes you just need to help people to take a few steps back and see the natural ramifications. We all agree that there are some absolute truths in life, whether we like to say it or not. For instance, if I climb to the top of the building and I put on a Wonder Woman outfit, right? And I jump off the top of the building, whether or not I agree with the truth that gravity exists, the truth will come crashing in on me, right? I will be collided with it. And so I think that sometimes that's an easy way of skirting the issue, but we can bring people back to, how do you figure out what's true? Rather than wrestling with it, because some people go, oh yeah, or they go around and around, they don't like that argument. You go, fine, your truth is not the same as my truth. I'll meet you there if you want to say that. How do you know what's true? What makes something true? What gives you confidence that there is true? We talk a lot about this in ours that I am, in the truth of God's message. You know, is your truth able to rightly explain reality for you? Does your truth consistently line up? Are there no logical fallacies in there? Is there nothing that says, well, black and white, they're both the same? Well, we know it's not the same. 2 + 2 = 5. Can you work out the different problems of it? So I think the bigger question is, how do you know what's true? If you think that you can define truth in and of yourself, how do you get to confidence that what you have defined as your own truth works for you, is lived out? And then, are you willing to give every single person that freedom? Let's look at the ramifications of what happens if what's true for you is fine and what's true for me is fine. Well, that's part of the reason why we have, after abolishing slavery years ago, the highest amount of human slavery ever happening, even bigger than the African slave trade. Because if we say what's true for you, I can't say in culture that it's really wrong to practice sex with little girls that are 2 years old, to kidnap people that are traveling, or to sell them off when your family is starving. I guess you could understand that and rationalize that. If everyone's true is dependent on what works for them, it gets society into a really bad predicament. So I think sometimes, without making it about an argument between you and another person, we take a few steps back and we ask further questions. With all of these hard questions, it's good to just ask people questions where they're at, to invite them in and say, help me understand what truth means to you. And then I will tell you what truth means to me. Does it help you describe reality? Does it make sense of life? Is it logical? You can put all these philosophical terms to it. You can just talk normally about it with people, and it usually resonates better. Anyone else? Just back here, sir.
So you've spoken about God's relationship with us and how he's trying to approach us. I guess my question is, how do we respond, or how do we as a Christian community identify people who have set their heart against God? How do we identify evil in the world, and what's an appropriate response to that?
Yeah. That's a really great question. How do we identify evil? You said, yeah. And how do we respond to it? The interesting thing is, I feel like it's not that hard and not that much a kept secret of believing or identifying in evil, right? So you'd be surprised the amount of atheists that don't believe in God or the supernatural, who have a real problem with anything that is eternal good, but can't shake an inability to describe that they have a sense of evil, that they want to pass moral judgment when someone is not treating people for the good of humanity, that there are things that they fear that they can't put their heart around. I don't think that evil and identifying evil in other people's hearts, I think most of the time our hearts identify that for us. So I think it's better to maybe ask the question, how do we live in a way that promotes good? How do we live in a way that shows where we come up with the idea of good? How do we live in a way in the midst of evil where we can suffer through the effects of evil in a way that is glorifying to this message of love and inclusion? That we can give people who don't have a reference for good, that don't know where they root it, a way of going, there is evil, it's real. The Christian message doesn't say evil is fake. The Christian message doesn't say you won't suffer, but the Christian message gives you a way to walk through it. It tells you why there's evil there. It tells you what the solution and what God did to provide a way out. And it gives you a God that you can not only turn to in the midst of the suffering, but who has suffered and identifies us with the suffering and provides a way out. So I think rather than focusing on identifying, well, you're evil through and through and you've turned your heart against God and, now I know where you stand. Us making sure that we're always identifying evil's real. Evil is something that we we will struggle with for all of human history, because it is the absence of good. It's when we take a step away from God, right? And it's showing people where good is rooted, how we get back to good, and how this good and loving God can walk us through the valley of the shadow of death, and we come out with hope. It's actually not identifying evil so much as there is hope in the midst of suffering. There is light that has come in the darkness. You talked about Christmas carol services already. Where does it start with? People walking in the valley of the shadow of death have seen a great light. Rather than focusing on identifying evil, showing that it is existing, but there is light. I don't know if that helps a little bit. I don't know where we're at time-wise.
I think we probably have time for one more quick question. If something is burning on your mind, you want to ask that, go ahead. Not seeing any hands. I have one quick question, if no one else does, but if there's another one. Frank.
Michelle, we talk about the Bible a lot. And a lot of times we have individuals who challenge the legitimacy of it. I know it's a passion of one of your colleagues, but if you could talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, one of the main things at the heart of isn't the message of Christianity irrelevant and outdated. People go, I mean, how do you even know what you're reading? Is the message of Christianity. How can I be sure that the Bible that we're passing around today hasn't it been translated into 3,000 different languages and hasn't it been changed over the time? We have this pop culture view of the Bible like the game of telephone. Are you familiar with it? That you start with a child that says the cat is brown, and by the time you get through the 20th child, it is the sun went down. You know? How do we know that this message is that inclusive and actually says truth? Well, I get so excited when this question happens rather than getting worried, because actually the scholarship that is there for the truth, the historical reliability of the Bible, it's actually unprecedented. I can stand up in any university setting across the world and say that there is greater reference and grounding and evidence for that the text of the New Testament that we read today is exactly the same as the original text and as it was written than any other work in history. That's just, it's a normal fact that's respected in the academy. Now, scholars that are not Christians will say that. They don't then jump and go, oh, that means everything within it is true. But the fact that the Bible has been changed, the fact that we don't know what the original text has been, the fact that we can't trust it, and there's all this stuff that might have been hidden from us, that's not really even a valid academic standpoint anymore. Really quickly, let me give you an example of why. There are thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of what we call fragments. I don't know if you've heard this before. Early copies of the New Testament. This is just the New Testament. There's stuff from the Old Testament as well, but just from the New Testament. We have those fragments in Koine Greek. We have them in Latin. We have them in Aramaic. So we have them in lots of different languages. We have them over a span as close to some of the earliest ones. I just before I left Oxford got to lead a tour at Magdalen College where there's possibly the oldest copy of Matthew's Gospel that is dated possibly, I used to have a picture, but I've changed mobiles, possibly the oldest copy of Matthew's Gospel that you can see under glass, you can't touch it, that some scholars have dated to almost exactly the 1st century. So do the math. If Jesus is, AD 33, that's only about 60 years. At the oldest, it's before the 2nd century, all right? So for Caesar Augustus, you're having hundreds of years before we're writing down again. We're talking about one generation, eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ. Why didn't they write it down right away? Why isn't it any closer, people might ask? Well, hello, they're running for their lives. They go somewhere else. They didn't have a typewriter. They're writing down, and we go, it takes people years to write manuscripts now when you've got computers. All right, they're spreading the gospel of the world. This scripture is the story of Mary Magdalene. All right, we've got tens of thousands of those. And why that's important is people go, well, you got all these fragments. Isn't that bad? Why do you want all these different versions? Is that we can piece together all of the different translations, all of the different versions through many different languages across hundreds, now thousands of years, and show that the Bible that we read today, apart from a few lines, which actually study Bibles note, no one's trying to hide it, is exactly the same scripts that were written. That's amazing. That is amazing. And where there are differences, the reason why it's good that we have those is we can track back to when the difference was introduced, and we can note it. Going, the earliest copies of John's Gospel, maybe you've read this in NIV. don't have Mary, the woman caught in adulteress, right? Now that shouldn't confuse people. That doesn't mean that wasn't there. Why it's still included in our Bible today is that the earliest fragment that we have it doesn't mean that we don't have earlier copies of the Bible. The earliest fragment didn't have that part in it, but there's enough referencing in all of the rest of synoptic gospels of this similar story, of this happening, that we're going to include it, we're going to leave that footnote. It is historically documented and academically documented. So then you just have to do some further research into what is documented and hasn't been changed. Is there evidence that it's true? And things like the Alpha Course, if you heard of it again, or the Case for Christ, least durable rights, or anything, looks at the historical evidence that Jesus Christ is the human evidence that we have, that the prophecies about God, that what we have about causology and everything else with how this world came to be, the way he lived, the way he fulfilled prophecy, the way he loved people, and the way he rose from the dead, verifies the evidence that we have. That's a really brief to a big, big topic, but it's just not true that there's not academic and historic evidence that the Bible that we read today hasn't been changed, and that there's a lot of evidence that the resurrection did take place. And actually no scholar will say that Jesus Christ was not an actual historical figure anymore. Most recently, a scholar in Australia, a big Twitter feed, we work with him in Canada, said that if he can find one tenured academic that will even take him on, that Jesus Christ was not a historical figure, not saying he was God, he would eat his Bible. You should follow it. And no one has come forward. No one has come forward. So that should give you confidence, I hope, today.